So let's take the material sample tray that we modeled in the last video and prepare it for rendering. And I'm going to add in a surface that is essentially a tabletop surface for this tray to rest on, such that when I render it, it convincingly feels like it's part of a physical scene and that we don't question the bounds or where this box is located. And I'm going to use a type of Vray geometry. So with Vray loaded into Studio Max, I'll have a geometry class type of Vray, and I'm going to choose a Vray Plane, and I'll place it, and I won't really see it in this case until I go into wireframe, and then what I'll see is I have a representation of a plane, but it is not of a particular size. And this is because a Vray plane is procedural geometry. It's an infinitely large plane. So it's going to work really well for this project where we just need a general background underneath my tray, something to catch shadow, something to reflect light, but non-specific. And I'm going to right-click my X, Y, and Z translation settings to center it in the origin of the universe, which is the same location that the bottom center of this box is in. Then let's make sure that Vray is set as my renderer. So I'm going to go to my rendering mode and change my renderer to Vray. I happen to be working on release 6 hotfix 2, and I'm going to leave all the default settings for now. I'm going to turn on in my perspective mode my safe frames so I can get a sense of the orientation, or the aspect ratio of my view. And then in my top view, I'm going to add in 2 Vray lights. So I'll go to my light settings of class Vray, make a rectangle light, and I'm going to make these kind of narrow lights. I'm going to duplicate this. Let's call this material sample. No, let's call this overhead lamp 01. And I'm just going to round out these numbers to 3 and 3 feet. And I'm going to zero this out. And then I think I was around, maybe I'll say 10 inches in the positive and 4 feet above the tabletop. So I'm using these dimensions down here to move that light 10 inches away from the origin and then 4 feet up. And if I were to look in perspective, that's where that light is. I'm going to make it a little bit larger, 4 feet and 5 inches. And then going back to my top view, I'm going to edit, clone an instance of this light. And so an instance, if we're not familiar with that, is going to share all of the same settings. So these two objects will be tied together. If I change the settings for one, the settings on the other will update. And let's set that X to negative 10 inches. So notice if I change the length on one, the other is updating. And if I change the width, the other is updating. Let's set the units to be radiant power watts, and let's just put in 50 watts for now. And then I'm going to make a camera of type physical. I'm going to click and drag and then select the camera. Let's set our selection filter to cameras. I'm going to take the target of that camera and right-click on my X, Y, and Z on these spinners to place the camera origin at 0. And then let's just X out the X and Y. Go back to my perspective, tap C on my keyboard to be looking through that camera. And then with the camera selected, I'm going to raise it on the Z axis using this spinner to bring it up looking down onto my object. And then I think I'm going to use my dolly to pull back a little bit. And let's look at the settings for that camera. You can see I have expanded this sidebar just by clicking and dragging it out to give me a little more room to see all of my settings. I'm going to set my aperture to 2.8, quite an open aperture, and set my shutter to be 1/250th of a second, not measured in frames, but measured in 1/seconds. And then I'm going to set my exposure not to a target EV value, but rather to an ISO of 200. And that will require a fair amount of light to expose well, but I think it's a reasonable settings for this if I were in the studio and I were taking a snapshot of this right here. So let's go to our render setup, and I'm going to change my output size to custom. I'm going to make it 1000 by 1000. And that gives me a square setting, and then I guess I can dolly in a little bit more. Let's just take a look at where that places our camera. It's quite reasonable. Assuming I was standing and looking into the material tray, this would be a reasonable angle. And then let's do a render. Let me change one more thing in my settings. Under my V-Ray render settings, I'm going to dial down and a max render time of just 1 minute for now. And so if we render, this is going to resolve for a minute. It is excessively bright. That is a combination of my camera settings and my light settings, but I'm pretty partial to my camera settings, so I'm going to set these down, these two lights, to 30 watts instead of 50, and render again. And let's just set them down to 20 watts. That is not bad. It's a touch overexposed. Maybe we'll go down to 15 watts. Bear in mind the camera settings that we have are really wide open aperture, really letting in quite a bit of light. So what we see here when we render is we have all of our objects. They are just using default colors for now, but we can see that they're casting shadows down onto the tray, which contains them and bounds them like a physical material tray might in certain industries. And then there's this infinite plane backdrop that we're seeing, and we can see it through color, but also through the shadows that we're getting dropped down here. So that's setting up our material tray scene for rendering in V-Ray.